All right. So, Jonathan, aren't we honoured to have a true pioneer, activist, advocate for Earth, for the environment? Joined the Greens Party in 1974. Whew. Friends of the Earth, and you could correct me if I got some of these wrong. Friends of the Earth, 1980. Part of the founding of the Prince of Wales Business and Sustainability Project, and also the Cambridge Institute for Sustainable Leadership, the chair of the UK Sustainable Development Commission, and one of the founders of the Forum for the Future. So Jonathan has dedicated his life, you could easily say that, to our precious and amazing Earth and her creatures. And so thank you, Jonathan.
It's a pleasure, and thank you very much for the introduction and the invitation. I'm delighted to be joining you for a little bit of time this morning, or whatever time of day it is for you, wherever you are in the world. To be honest, it's a rather wonderful morning to be waking up on, because the news is full of what the new president, Joe Biden, and the new vice president, Kamala Harris, have been doing in the few hours since they took over the US administration, and it's pretty much all upside. And I love a morning that starts off with all upside, not least the decision, of course, for the USA to re-enter the Paris Agreement and to put America's shoulder to the wheel of addressing climate change. But there was something about the tone, there was something about the way in which they both spoke yesterday during the inauguration procedures. It was just so refreshing and inspiring to start listening to some intelligent and sensitive, empathetic voices in the US in terms of the next 4 years. So for me, that was great, and a real uplift against a backdrop that obviously is still very oppressive for an awful lot of people in many countries all around the world, and we can't turn away from that. And a lot depends now on how quickly we can move forward this sort of more purposeful addressing of these crises, whether they are the crises of our relationship with the natural world in terms of climate change, or all the threats to biodiversity, or whether they're the kind of socioeconomic crises that we're also finding ourselves in the midst of, a world still massively scarred by astonishing levels of inequality, both economic inequality and racial inequality, on which we've made relatively little progress, as we can see from America today. The great thing about the Biden-Harris proposition, and it is a really remarkable proposition, I spent quite a lot of time looking at their election campaign and what they were calling for in the context of climate change and the environment, and this notion of a New Deal, which of course resonates incredibly strongly in the USA, resonates quite strongly here in the EU as well these days, because we have a great big, quite exciting, dynamic European Green Deal, which is important. But in America, the New Deal, the Roosevelt New Deal, has an enormous amount of historical resonance. And what Biden and Harris have put together is really remarkable. It's a quite extraordinary proposition, not just because there's a big dollar price tag attached to it. The $2 trillion is quite a lot of investment in different ways of creating wealth and rebuilding communities in the USA, but because of its absolutely unapologetic focus on doing this in ways that help to heal both the ecological and the social damage done over many, many years in the USA. And I'll come back to that in a moment. So this is a really a shot in the arm for people who understand the true significance of 2021. I know you can always overdo this. Every year is important, let's be honest. And we all love to play the card that says this year is more important than any other year. But there's sort of some truth in this one, because we know that we have to do pretty much all the difficult things that need to be done by 2030 if we're going to have a chance of building the world we want and creating a stable climate and so on. We have to do that by 2030, the heavy lifting. That means halving emissions of greenhouse gases by 2030, an astonishingly ambitious and problematic thing to kind of contemplate, halving the emissions. So we're roughly at 40 billion tons annual emissions at the moment. by 2030, we have to be much closer to 20 billion tons. It is an incredible thing to kind of wrap your mind around. It really is. So we know 2021 is critical because that will create the conditions for the next decade. The year ends, of course, with the big conference of the parties, as they're called, this big climate conference in Glasgow at the end of the year. And you can see how an awful lot of things are beginning to shape up for that and for the challenge entailed in that. The incredible thing is, it really is happening. This quickening pulse is all around us. And I can't tell you, actually, in a short talk, just what this acceleration in these transformative processes feels like. It's utterly remarkable. A lot of it is driven by technology. I can't turn away from that. There are some absolutely revolutionary things going on in terms of the technologies now available to us to build the foundations of this very different kind of economy. And we still have to do that. However much we may feel we're, as you put it, we're sometimes moving the deck chairs, we still have to do what needs to be done to keep our economy on track for the billions of people who depend on current systems of generating wealth, creating value. So this revolution, particularly in solar technology, other renewable energy technologies, particularly wind, in quite boring areas of technology like storage. Nobody seems to get excited about storage and batteries, but you should all be utterly excited about what is happening in that field of human endeavor. It's technology breakthrough on battery and storage technology. These are extraordinary shifts happening at a speed that almost nobody can imagine. They're not rich world shifts. These are shifts that will actually impact on the lives of every citizen on planet Earth. Just thinking of what we're going to hear about in a moment in terms of some of the impacts of this in Africa. The solar energy story is so important for Africa. It does create the opportunity for decentralized off-grid and on-grid energy systems at an affordable price, which will transform the lives of hundreds of millions of people across the African continent. So these things are really important. They are moving so fast. I am finding it really difficult just to keep track of this transformative process. The floodgates of innovation are open. And when you create this moment where everybody, and I mean now everybody, understands that we're in a very different context to make sense of our human destiny, then innovation is an extraordinary force to behold. And in my opinion now, it will mean that one of those incumbencies, and we heard a bit about the importance of incumbency just a moment ago, that one of the big incumbencies that we're still stuck with, which is the incumbency of the fossil fuel industries, that incumbency will be overcome in the next decade. We will have freed ourselves from our incumbent dependency on fossil fuels within a decade. I mean, that, honestly, that is pretty startling. So for me, there's just a sense of, I call it this quickening, because it's not that these ideas haven't been out there before. It's not that people haven't been interested before. It's not that there haven't been opportunities, both from a political and a financial perspective before. They've all been there for decades. But right now you can see how this is beginning to unfold very, very differently indeed. Now, you will all know on a call like this that there is a lot more to this than technology. That's just the precursor, if you like. It is the condition that makes a lot of other things possible. But there's so much more to what is happening than just the technology, which is why I mentioned the Kamala Harris and Joe Biden climate plan. It's more Kamala Harris's plan, by the way, than it is Joe Biden's. And we'll see that a lot over the course of the next 4 years, because it's her who has injected into that plan the central element of climate justice. And it's a remarkable document and a remarkable affirmation of the possibility of doing the right thing socioeconomically by addressing the sustainability, the ecological challenges that we have to address. So to give you just a simple example, there's a pre-commitment in the plan. It still has to be firmed up, obviously, but there's a pre-commitment that out of whatever the expenditure will be on creating a low carbon economy in the USA, 40% of that expenditure, 40% of the $2 trillion will be directed explicitly towards those communities that have suffered disproportionately as a consequence of the environmental damage done over the last few decades. So particularly communities of color, particularly communities of disadvantaged people who've just been left behind by the industrial economy. I consider that to be absolutely critical, making sure that a climate justice story, it takes the front line, if you like, is right out there, not just a climate transition, a story about new technology, but doing it with justice absolutely embedded within it is the only way, I mean this, the only way in which we will be able to bring people with us on this unbelievably fast ride that we are now on. If we don't bring people with us, we don't make it inclusive, if we don't address what have often been called the left behind, I don't mind what terminology you use, but all of those people who have not been beneficiaries of our mad, grab it and run kind of global economy over the last 40 years, if we don't build them into this vision of what a different world looks like, we won't be able to get there, because the opposition, the sense that this isn't for us, this is something that's been foisted upon us, we don't see how this is going to help us and our communities and make life better for us. So this is absolutely critical for me. And the great thing is, although we're still in the midst of a devastating pandemic and people calculating the cost now in a very different way than they did a year ago, when we didn't really understand the full extent of this. Incredible, the situation in America. They're waking up now to the fact that the number of people who've died in America is equivalent to the number of people who died through the Second World War, in terms of the support that America put into that necessary endeavor. And it's, for me, remarkable to think that we now need to relearn some of the lessons of the pandemic. They're important lessons. And I just want to end on that point, because it seems to me that we're still struggling to land what those lessons actually look like for ordinary people in their lives. We tend to go to slightly romanticized places. You know, people are still talking about the joy of reconnecting with the natural world as one of the lessons of the pandemic. And for an awful lot of people, that is true. Earlier this morning, I went for my regular early morning walk, amazingly stormy around here. We have two fiercely combative territorial robins out in the front of our house here every single morning between sort of 5 and 6 o'clock. They're going at each other by song. I want you to know, they don't, as far as I can tell, they don't actually involve in any avian fisticuffs, but it is just an unbelievable reminder of the resilience and the power of the natural world. Now, I feel that very strongly, but I am also very conscious that even here in my little town of Cheltenham in Gloucestershire in the UK, there are thousands of people in Cheltenham who are getting nothing out of this pandemic process, out of this necessity of relearning about the world. And they're certainly not reconnecting with the natural world because they can't. Their living conditions don't allow for it very easily. Many people are stuck at home. Many people are doing home learning for their kids in conditions that are not as conducive to that as you might want. So it's a tough call for a huge number of people, a really tough call. Which we need to be very much more sensitive to than sometimes we seem to be. But we have learned some critical lessons. They are landing now increasingly. They teach us that we need to think about our economy very differently from the economy that preceded the COVID-19 crisis. And that if we are going to be successful in building back better, I noticed that that phrase is now not just much beloved of Boris Johnson, but also is picked up a bit by Joe Biden. If we are going to build back better, then we have to do it in ways that embrace these very different priorities for a different world. I don't doubt that we're going to be able to do that. In fact, it's disappointing so far. If you look at the story about the trillions of dollars which will be invested in building back our economies, so far it's not a particularly good record that we have. People are talking about $14 to $15 trillion of government and central bank investment in creating new economic activity, if you like, not just propping up the economy through the pandemic, but ensuring that new pathways to prosperity can be created as we come out of the pandemic, whatever that may look like. At the moment, a lot of that investment is going into what I would still call the sunset industries, the industries of yesterday, the incumbency, if you like, of the fossil fuel and extractive economy. And we have to shift that in short order. We have to get that money flowing into the economic activity of the future, creating this new pattern of prosperity. Are the politicians up for that? Mm-hmm. That's the story that I tried to unfold in Hope in Hell in my new book. We're much more aware now of what the science tells us about climate change. We're aware of what politicians are struggling to make happen now. We are beginning to hear good signals. The world is awash suddenly with net zero rhetoric about commitments to get to a net zero economy by 2050. But the gap between the science and the politics is still enormous. And for me, the principal endeavor now in my life, personally, over the next few years, is to do what I can to help narrow that gap and make it a realistic proposition for people anywhere in the world. So I'll stop there because I know we've got time for some Q&A, and it may be more helpful to see if I can pick up any interest in that you might have. Thanks.
Lovely. Thank you, Jonathan. So, yeah. So please, if you want to ask a question, just raise your hand. I can see you unmute and ask away. Yeah, Paul, you want to ask a question?
Ask a question, and also thanks to Jonathan, by the way, for your insights. I have been working quite some time on developing a new framework for economy. I'm not an economist, and that's probably an advantage, that you are now thinking differently about what a mess we made and how you can change it. So what I actually did is make a combination, and it comes down to where Christine started with. It's your purpose, you know. I'm always asking people, individual and as a company, what is your purpose? Where do you want to go? And it is not the massive transformative purpose that we usually use, but inclusive, massive transformative purpose. That means that we include environmental impacts, diversity, etc. So I came up with a model that on one, can I share my screen quickly? Or
I need, we've only got a limited amount of time, so this is for people to ask Jonathan questions. So if you have a question, if you could ask him specifically, otherwise we need to take it out to other people.
So Jonathan, what is your focus in working on a new economy? Where is your focus? Where is your point of gravity there?
Well, happily, as I'm sure you will have discovered in your research for a new economy, the work that precedes us in this area is enormous. And the kind of shoulders of those on whom today's economists now stand are amazing. And we can draw on that heritage. For me, Herman Daly is one of the great economic gurus of our movement, who was the first one in the modern time, because obviously there are many, many economists before that, who mapped out exactly what a post-growth economy would look like, an economy that was not dependent on conventional measures of GDP and per capita income, was extremely, absolutely focused on how you could still create prosperity for people without this manic obsession around growth per se, increases in GDP. More recently, of course, we have the incredible work of Tim Jackson, who wrote this book, Prosperity Without Growth, which is, again, a wonderful primer in how you can do this business of more inclusive, and you mentioned that word, more empathic and compassionate ways of creating and distributing wealth. And I get a very strong sense now that many people are beginning to understand we can't simply go back to our old growth-based extractive economy, we have to do this very differently. I can't say that's reflected in the current discourse in contemporary politics. You do not pick up in the Build Back Better narratives any real sense that we need to free ourselves of that dependence on ecocidal growth of the kind that we know, but you can begin to see some reflections of the need to do it very differently.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Lovely. Anyone else got a question for Jonathan?
Christine, if I may.
Yes.
So this is Chandra from Zurich in Switzerland. So insightful, and Christine, lovely to be part of your community and join for the first time today. But going back to Jonathan, your keyword from the last answer, prosperity without growth. And this is where my question come challenge would be, I think, old days we used to say growth without prosperity or unequal growth, and now we are shifting the equilibrium to say prosperity without growth. Couldn't be landing up in a conflict of the other magnitude order. We will have prosperity but not growth. So why we are not targeting prosperity with growth, perhaps? So are we going in the wrong direction, perhaps, in the new model?
Well, not yet. To a certain extent,
hopefully not, but the choice of the words matter.
Yeah. Well, Chandra, as you will know, the old standby was we still have to have growth, because without growth, we can't address poverty. But what we've seen is that the growth today, much of the growth that we create today actually exacerbates poverty. It actually makes the inequality worse. It makes the pattern of destruction to the natural world worse. It makes the limitations and oppressions that many people feel in their world worse. So from my perspective, the idea that the reason why we principally need growth is to address inequality and poverty is just a busted flush as an idea, both in the rich world and the poor world. I mean, you look at who's actually benefited from the last 20 years of growth-driven economic policy, and it sure as hell isn't the poor. It isn't even the middle classes. I mean, one of the most astonishing things to look at is the degree to which the middle class in America in particular has been completely hollowed out with no improvements in the material standard of living for the vast majority of the US middle classes. One of the reasons why the politics of Trump was so successful is that he was able to appeal in this perverse way to those people who had actually lost out to that particular kind of growth-driven extractive industry. So I'm much more robust now in pushing back on the idea that addressing poverty and inequality depends on economic growth as we have known that growth, because I don't believe that to be true. I believe we need to create growth very differently for the future.
Amen to that.
Thank you. Perhaps one more quick question before we switch to Sarah. So if anyone has a question for Jonathan, amazing opportunity. Anyone at all? I will raise my hand if no one else does.
Thank you, Christine.
Well, you mentioned, so this auspicious day, of course, with seeing the end of a nightmare of time in geopolitics, but and the push of the Biden-Harris administration, we have, of course, a fossil in the leadership of Australia, a genuine fossil. And so do you see that people like that are going to maintain their ability to have any credibility in this next couple of years?
Yes, well, Christine, thank you. You're right. The fossil fuel incumbency is pervasive in many parts of the world, and Australia has suffered disproportionately from that over the last few years. There comes a point where even a fossil as embedded as Scott Morrison will not be able to resist the tide that is now engulfing energy politics around the world. And it's absolutely fascinating for me to see the ways in which changes in China, South Korea, Japan, in those countries will actually change Australia more than changes in Australia will change Australia. Mm. So in all of those countries, the countries on which Australia depends to sell off its natural resources, in all of those countries, we're seeing an accelerated understanding that they have to free themselves of this dependence on fossil fuels, particularly on coal. Is there a way out of the situation for Scott Morrison, who's so deeply embedded in this? Well, there is one way out only, Christine, and it's a sort of crazy tech fix, which many people don't really like. But Australia could be that one of the greatest producers of green hydrogen, to use literally limitless renewable energy sources, which Australia has. I've spent quite a lot of time in Australia, and I love the country dearly. And I have noticed there is quite a lot of sunshine and stuff around in Australia. The opportunity to turn these natural resources, the renewable resources, particularly the wind and solar, into cheap renewable electricity to produce the green hydrogen that industrial economies like Japan, South Korea, and China will need, is remarkable. And we have recently, by the way, in the last 2 months, very quickly seen the first steel plants opening up using green hydrogen instead of fossil fuels, instead of gas and coal. And these are little indicators. So in my new book, I have taken a punt on the fact that Australia will be one of the world's largest providers of green hydrogen by 2025, and will be making a ton more money out of that than out of your coal, which can stay happily under the precious ground on which you all walk.
Yeah.